There's something about the ocean that never lets you forget. Maybe it's the way the waves keep returning to the shore, like memories that refuse to be buried. For me, the sea is no longer a place of peace. It's a place of grief. Because when I look out across that endless water, all I see is the last place my brother was ever seen. George Smith Ivy disappeared on what was supposed to be the happiest trip of his life, a honeymoon cruise through the Mediterranean with his new wife. He was young, only 26, full of energy, laughter, and plans for the future. And then, in a single night, he was gone. No witnesses, no body, just a massive blood stain on a lifeboat canopy and a locked cabin. That held more questions than answers. They told us it was an accident, said he'd been drinking, that maybe he fell off the balcony in a drunken stumble. But I've looked at every photo, read every report, listened to every statement, and what I found was a story full of contradictions, evasions, and silence. This wasn't just a tragic fall. This was something darker, something deliberate. And someone on that ship knows exactly what happened to George that night. It's been nearly 20 years and we still don't have justice. But we're not done. Not yet. Because stories like this need to be told, not buried. And if you believe the truth still matters, then subscribe and stay with me. Over the next 14 minutes, I'm going to take you through the entire night, everything we know. Everything they won't say. Everything that still keeps us awake. George wasn't just my brother. He was the kind of person who left an impression on everyone. He met the moment he walked into a room. People noticed not because he was loud, but because he was alive. There was something in his smile, in the way he talked with his hands, in the way he made you feel like you mattered. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was kind and funny, and always looking forward. He worked with my father at the family liquor store back in Greenwich, Connecticut, and was getting ready to take it over someday. He had ideas to expand it, to modernize it, to turn it into something bigger than it already was, and my father was proud even if he'd never say it out loud. George brought energy into that place. He brought people to. He was the kind of guy customers actually looked forward to seeing, and outside of work, he had just started building a new chapter of his life. He'd been with Jennifer for a few years before they married, and from the outside they looked happy. She was bright, outgoing, always smiling in pictures, and they seemed like a perfect match. Their wedding was beautiful, set by the water, with everyone we loved gathered around. It was the kind of day you take 100 photos of because it feels like the beginning of something strong. When they told us about the honeymoon cruise, we were thrilled for them. Sailing from Barcelona through the Greek Isles. It was everything young couples dream of, a romantic adventure across the sea. No one could have imagined that less than 2 weeks after the wedding, George would vanish without a trace on that ship, and everything would fall apart, not only for Jennifer but for all of us. The 5th night of the cruise started like any other evening on board, filled with music, laughter, and the kind of casual celebration that happens when people are far from home and surrounded by strangers who quickly become friends. George and Jennifer had been spending time with another couple, Paul and Galena people. They'd met early in the trip and instantly clicked with that night. The 4 of them made their way to the casino where most of the adults gathered after dinner. It was buzzing with energy, the sound of slot machines, coins clinking, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional cheer when someone won big. George and Jennifer had been spending time with another couple, Paul and Galena people. They'd met early in the trip and instantly clicked with that night. The 4 of them made their way to the casino where most of the adults gathered after dinner. It was buzzing with energy, the sound of slot machines, coins clinking, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional cheer when someone won big. George loved craps. That was always his game, and that night He was right in the middle of it, tossing dice, sipping his drink, talking to everyone, like they'd known him for years. Jennifer floated between the blackjack table and her husband's side, looking happy, tipsy, but in control. Somewhere along the way, another group joined them, 3 young men. Russian-American cousins Zachary and Greg Rosenberg, and their friend Rusty Kaufman. They were loud, confident, the kind of guys who always seemed just a little too sure of themselves. They'd been drinking too, and the atmosphere round the table began to shift a little. The laughter became more intense, the stories louder. George was clearly drunk more than usual. His tolerance was low, and it showed, Paul would later say. He told George it was time to call it a night, to go back to the cabin and sleep it off. But George didn't listen. Maybe he was having too much fun. Maybe he trusted the wrong people. Maybe both. Not long after midnight, George left the casino briefly to grab more cash for Jennifer, then returned smiling, unaware that these were the final hours of his life, and that something dark was already taking shape around him. As the night wore on, the casino began to quiet, the energy started to fade, and people slowly drifted out in pairs or groups, looking for food or music or simply a place to sit and let the drinks settle. George was visibly intoxicated, his steps uncertain, his speech slower than usual. Jennifer had clearly had a lot to drink, but at some point she wandered off without him. No one knows exactly when or why, but she didn't return to the cabin with George. That much is certain. What we do know is that when the casino finally closed, George was still surrounded by the same group of young men, Zach, Greg, Rusty, and another passenger named Josh, a Sin, who had been friendly with George earlier in the cruise. Security logs from the ship would later show that just before 4 a.m., the 4 men helped George back to his room, cabin 9062 on deck 9. He could barely walk on his own, and was seen being carried by the others down the hallway. They claimed they were just helping a drunk friend get back safely, and at first glance that seems believable. One of them said George thanked them, gave them hugs, even a kiss on the cheek, grateful for their help. And then, according to their story, they all left the cabin together, locking the door behind them and returning to their own rooms. But that's where the story begins to unravel, because a few minutes later, witnesses in cabins beside George reported hearing loud voices coming from 9062, not laughter, not celebration, but arguing male voices raised in tension, and someone repeating the words "good night" over and over again, like they were trying to end something, trying to close the door on a scene that didn't want to be closed. Around 4:15 in the morning, something strange happened. A passenger in the cabin next to George's, a deputy police chief on vacation, reported waking up to the sound of shouting. He described it as loud male voices coming from George's room. At first, he assumed it was just a drinking game or some rowdy friends still up too late. But then the tone changed. It no longer sounded like fun. He said it became an argument. And then there was a pause, a kind of silence that made him sit up in bed and listen more carefully. Moments later, he heard the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Not just voices now, but furniture being moved, drawers slamming shut, and something or someone banging around in the room. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Another couple on the opposite side of George's cabin reported similar sounds. They said it sounded like someone was throwing furniture, maybe in anger or panic. Still, neither of them reported it immediately. On a cruise ship, loud noises in the early morning aren't uncommon, and people tend to mind their own business. But then came the sound no one could forget. A loud thud, sharp and metallic, echoing through the floor. It sounded like something heavy had dropped onto the lifeboat canopy outside George's balcony. And that's when everything went quiet. No more voices. No more movement. Just an eerie silence that seemed to spread from cabin 9062 like a ripple on still water. What no one realized in that moment was that George Smith had likely just gone overboard And whatever happened inside that room would soon become the center of one of the most haunting mysteries in modern maritime history. By the time the sun rose over Kusadasi, Turkey, the ship had docked. Passengers were beginning to stir, stepping out onto their balconies, sipping coffee, admiring the view. But for one teenage girl named Emily, what she saw that morning was not the coastline. It was blood, a dark, heavy stain splattered across the white canopy of the lifeboats just beneath George's balcony. She took a photo of it, thinking someone must have died. She was right. Meanwhile, the crew realized George and Jennifer weren't responding to morning calls. Housekeeping had tried knocking, paging them over the intercom. Nothing. When the room was finally opened, they found a scene that didn't make sense. Jennifer wasn't there. George was missing. The sheets were rumpled. There were 2 thin streaks of blood on the bed, just a few centimeters each, as if something sharp had grazed the skin. It wasn't enough to scream murder, but it was enough to raise alarms. Security began checking keycard logs. They confirmed George had entered the room with the young men at 3:52 a.m., and the last log showed the door opened again at 4:01. After that, nothing, no exit, no sign of George leaving. He didn't call room service. He didn't show up on any hallway cameras. It was like he vanished. Jennifer, meanwhile, was found lying unconscious in a hallway. Crew members discovered her slumped on the carpet, still dressed, her shoes kicked off. She told them she had no idea what happened. She said she blacked out, didn't remember anything after the casino. And now, her husband was missing, and there was blood outside their balcony. As word spread through the ship that a passenger was missing, the mood shifted instantly. What had been a normal morning in port turned tense. They interviewed staff, examined the cabin, took photos, and collected blood samples. Then, one by one, they began questioning the young men who had been with George the night before. Josh Asin, Rusty Kaufman, Zachary Rosenberg, Greg Rosenberg. So if everyone had left, then who was still in the room when George went overboard? All four had been seen escorting George back to his room, and all four insisted they had left him there alive, alone, and extremely drunk. Ship security sealed off cabin 9062 and began gathering statements. Jennifer was taken to guest relations. They claimed it was all friendly, all innocent. But when police asked about the blood, about the loud noises, about who left last, they started pointing fingers. Some said George had wanted to go find Jennifer. Others said he was passed out cold. And one of them made a statement that would later come back to haunt him. He said, "We helped him to bed, and then we all left. Every single one of us." She appeared shaken, confused, and repeatedly said she couldn't remember anything. "I just want to call my dad," she kept saying. And that's exactly what she did before anyone from Royal Caribbean called George's parents. Jennifer's father made the call that would break the Smith family's world apart. On board, Turkish police had already arrived to begin their investigation. Security footage showed the group walking through the hallways, sometimes carrying George between them. But that's not what the neighbors heard. And the cabin's keycard data showed no one else had entered after 4:01 a.m. The young men's stories began to fray almost immediately. At first, they all claimed they left George's room together and went straight back to their own cabin. The ship's room service logs showed no official order was placed from their cabin. A few short calls had been made to room service, but nothing was written down. One neighbor reported seeing 3 men walking away from George's cabin after the argument. Only 3, not 4. So where was the missing one? If 3 walked out, did one stay behind? And if so, for what? That unanswered question would become the center of every theory that followed. No one from the kitchen recalled delivering food to them. No trays, no plates, no charges. The feast never happened. There, they said, they ordered room service sandwiches, cheeseburgers, sodas like it was just another night on the cruise. Maybe it was human error. Maybe someone forgot to record it. But the timing didn't match either. George is believed to have gone overboard between 4:15 and 4:30 a.m. If the food wasn't even ordered until after that window, then it couldn't be their alibi. They described it as a silly feast, laughing about how they could order anything they wanted. No limits. That was their alibi. They weren't anywhere near George when he supposedly fell. They were busy, eating. But something about that story didn't sit right. And when investigators finally got access to Royal Caribbean's internal logs, it began to fall apart. Still, their attorneys insisted the meal had taken place. Even more troubling was what the neighbors had seen, or rather, what they didn't. After the thud that echoed from the lifeboat canopy, everything went still. It was around 4:30 in the morning, and outside George's cabin, the ship was quiet. No alarms, no search parties, just silence. 2 narrow streaks of blood were found on the white sheet, small but distinct, as if something sharp or metallic had caused them. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass. Maybe he caught them in the act. Maybe there was a fight, and maybe, in the chaos, he was pushed, or struck, or thrown overboard. But on the balcony, the railing was bare, and directly below it, the blood stain marked the lifeboat's canopy like a signature. It wasn't until hours later, when the blood stain was discovered and George was missing, that the possibility of something terrible was considered. The noises neighbors heard, slamming drawers, voices shouting, furniture shifting, sounded more like a struggle. Some speculated that whoever remained in that room may have tried to steal from George, who was wearing an expensive Breitling watch and rumored to have thousands in cash. Security entered the Smith cabin and documented everything. Photos were taken of the bed, the floor, the furniture. George's family believes this wasn't a fall. He didn't sit on the balcony drunk and accidentally slip. Maybe George woke up. The crew insisted there was no sign of foul play. The captain even told passengers it was likely an accident. But the stain, the noise, and the timeline didn't match up. And for George's family, the most haunting part wasn't just that he fell, it was the feeling that someone watched him fall and walked away without looking back. While all eyes were turning toward the group of young men, another name kept surfacing: Jennifer, George's wife. At the time of his disappearance, she wasn't in the cabin. She didn't know where she had gone or how she ended up in the hallway. She didn't collect his things. She didn't walk the halls to retrace his steps. She just left. She assumed George had stayed out longer or returned to the other couple's room. And maybe that was true. Maybe the night broke something in her. But the questions lingered. Why couldn't she remember anything? And why did her memory loss begin exactly where George's timeline ends? Too many, including George's family. That explanation felt hollow. How could you not know where your husband was? How could you go to sleep on the floor of a hallway and not once check if he was back? She was found passed out in a hallway on deck 9, not far from their room, slumped against a wall, confused, shoeless, and dazed. When she was brought to guest services and informed that George was missing, her reaction was strange. She didn't ask for details. She didn't ask to search. She just said she didn't remember. According to her, after leaving the casino, her memory was blank. Even stranger was what happened afterward. Jennifer left the ship in the next port and flew home. without ever stepping foot into the cabin she had shared with her husband. Later, she would go on national television to defend herself, claiming trauma, confusion, and memory loss. Was she just a young woman in shock? Or was she protecting someone or something? That happened in that room while George Smith was taking his last steps. Not long after George's disappearance, a new piece of evidence emerged, one that would add a disturbing layer to an already chilling story. A video, not from security cameras, but a handheld recording made by the same group of young men who had been with George in his final hours. The footage wasn't taken during the crime. It wasn't even taken in secret. Who jokes about a man who just died? Who films themselves laughing about it within hours of his body vanishing into the sea? It was a casual recording of them sitting around a lunch table, hours after George went missing, laughing and joking. But it wasn't just laughter. It was what they were laughing about. On the tape, one of the men casually references George going parachute riding off his balcony. Another throws up gang signs and says, "Told you I was gangster," while smirking. That they were just drunk and immature. But to investigators, it felt more like arrogance. Like they were daring someone to figure out the truth. Because if they had nothing to hide, why would they act like this? Why record it at all? They mocked George's wealth, his reputation, his disappearance as if it were an inside joke only they understood. It wasn't an admission, at least not legally. But the tone, the timing, the coldness, it was hard to ignore. These weren't the actions of innocent men, at least not to George's family. Attorneys for the men claimed it was all just tasteless humor, that they didn't know George had died at the time, and for a case already drowning in silence and half-truths. That video became a scream the world could not ignore. As investigators pushed deeper into the case, they began turning to one of the few tools left to break through the silence: polygraph tests. Jennifer took one and passed. The casino manager, who had been rumored to have followed her out of the disco that night, also passed. But he answered nothing. Question after question, he invoked the Fifth Amendment. Even simple ones: his name, his birth date, were met with the same answer. He was loud, animated, defensive. He insisted George was already asleep when they left, and that they had ordered food right after. But the ship's record said otherwise. And so did the growing weight of inconsistencies stacked against them. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right," over and over again. His liar later explained it was a protective strategy, saying the FBI had warned that any inconsistencies, even small ones, could lead to perjury charges. But when it came to the young men, the ones who brought George to his room, the last ones to see him alive, the story shifted. Who carried George? He couldn't recall. Who opened the door? He wasn't sure. His memory had suddenly grown foggy, almost conveniently so. Zachary Rosenberg followed the same script: vague recollections, no concrete answers. And then finally, silence. Joshison, the college student from California who had spent time with George at the craps table, was the first to take the stand in a deposition. Rusty Kaufman didn't plead the Fifth, but said he couldn't remember most of the night. Only Greg Rosenberg spoke freely, from inside a Florida prison, where he was serving time for drug trafficking. He claimed he had nothing to do with George's death. As the timeline continued to fracture under closer examination, a new theory began to take shape, one that offered a possible motive. It was never officially proven, but it made more sense than the idea of a simple accident. George had been wearing a luxury Breitling watch that night. He was known to flash cash at the casino, ordering drinks, tipping generously. Something irreversible. Something that ends with blood on a canopy and a life lost to the sea? People assumed he had money, maybe more than he actually did. And word got around the ship fast. Passengers overheard George and Jennifer talking about having thousands of dollars locked away in their cabin. Whether that was true didn't matter. Perception was everything. That night, when George was helped back to his cabin by the four young men, something may have shifted. One of them reportedly went into the bathroom. The others were left alone with George, who was almost unconscious. According to a neighbor, there was arguing, a loud commotion, and then only 3 men seen leaving the room. So what if one of them stayed behind? Attorney Mike Jones, who investigated the case for George's family, believes that someone tried to rob George while he was semi-conscious. Maybe they went for the watch. Maybe they searched the drawers for cash. The streaks of blood on the sheet, just centimeters long, could have come from skin being pinched while removing a tight wristband. Disoriented and survival, angry, confused, a struggle broke out. Someone panicked. But then, maybe George woke up, and in that moment, it stopped being about theft. It became about silence. Because if you're drunk, vulnerable, and confronted in your sleep, how quickly does a robbery turn into something worse? Years passed, and still there were no charges, no arrests, no closure. The FBI claimed the case remained open, but to the Smith family, it didn't feel that way. There would be no courtroom, no justice, just silence. It was money that had been meant for George's future, for his family, for the life he never got to live. And instead, it became one last plea to the world, one last hope that anyone would come forward. They had spent 10 years pushing every legal angle, every media appearance, hiring private investigators, releasing photos, making timelines public, all in hopes that someone would finally break the silence. They weren't getting updates. They weren't getting answers. And in 2015, a decade after George vanished, the case was officially declared closed due to insufficient evidence. That was the moment the floor dropped again for his family. 10 years, 97,000 pages of investigation, hours of interviews, forensics, surveillance, blood, witnesses, and they called it an accident. George's father was devastated. His mother, already living with the weight of not knowing, was now being told that her son's life wouldn't he even get a final verdict. They even offered a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest and conviction. Even now, after all these years, there are moments when his family thinks they might still hear from him. A phone call, a knock at the door, a strange dream that feels a little too real. He was a man who laughed too loud, who loved too deeply, who believed that the world was full of good people. And maybe it was, but not that night, not on that ship. Because when there's no body, no official cause of death, no justice, you don't just lose someone once. Share this story. Keep his name alive. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with not looking away. Maybe they've convinced themselves that time has erased the truth, but it hasn't. Time only makes the silence louder. And the Smiths haven't stopped listening. They haven't stopped asking. They haven't stopped hoping. A brother, a husband, a friend. You lose them over and over again. Every night you close your eyes and wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's still something left to find. With stories that keep being told, even when no one wants to hear them anymore. And maybe, just maybe, someone watching this right now knows something. Maybe that person is you. But George Smith IV is not just a mystery. He was a son. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened. Maybe they were there. Maybe they've stayed quiet all this time. Because justice doesn't come with a deadline. It comes with persistence. with people who refuse to forget. So if you believe George deserves the truth, if you believe families deserve answers, do one small thing: subscribe. And we're not looking away.